Welcome to Breaking Green, a podcast by Global Justice Ecology Project. On Breaking Green, we will talk with activists and experts to examine the intertwined issues of social, ecological, and economic injustice. We will also explore some of the more outrageous proposals to address climate and environmental crises that are falsely being sold as green. I am your host, Steve Taylor.
The notion of humanity reaching the stars in a conquest of space is a modern mythology. It is part of our collective imagination and is infused in our culture and politics. Increasingly, billionaire technologists insist that in order for our species to survive, we must inhabit alien worlds, such as Mars. But is there really an alternative planet for humanity? Or are we deluding ourselves with dreams of alternative worlds for humankind that are based on faulty assumptions? In this episode of Breaking Green, we'll talk with Dennis Meredith, author of the new book Earthbound. Meredith argues that current science indicates that humans are fundamentally unable to survive long-term deep space exploration, and that its promoters are ignoring research that clearly shows humans are an earthbound species despite visions of reaching the stars. He is author of numerous books, including How to Reach Key Audiences to Advance Your Work, The Climate Pandemic, How Climate Disruption Threatens Human Survival, and Earthbound, The Obstacles to Human Space Exploration and the Promise of Artificial Intelligence. Meredith holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in chemistry from the University of Texas and a Master's of Science in Biochemistry and Science Writing from the University of Wisconsin. Dennis Meredith has worked as a science communicator at leading research universities, including MIT, Caltech, Cornell, Duke, and the University of Wisconsin. Dennis Meredith, welcome to Breaking Green.
Thanks so much for having me, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
It's a pleasure to have you. I've read your most recent book, Earthbound, and I will tell you it addressed some topics I have been thinking about for some years. For many decades, there's been this mythology, this hope, or this narrative that humankind is going to go to other planets and maybe other stellar systems, become a multiple planet species. But you take a position in your book that there are hurdles that make that very unlikely, if not impossible. So what brought you, Dennis Meredith, to write such a contrarian book?
Well, first of all, I am a big space buff. I watched, when I was at Caltech, I watched the Voyager flybys. I've seen the space shuttle land. I've gone to the NASA visitors centers, and I've watched the video of happy astronauts in space. And that was what I brought to the book. But then I decided, let's just take a look at the science. Let's take a look at what the research really says about what whether there are obstacles to humans going into deep space. Now, I should contrast deep space with orbital space around the Earth. That's a protected harbor. It's protected from radiation. Because of the Earth's magnetosphere, and it's protected from isolation because astronauts can get back home pretty quickly. So, okay, I wanted to know what was happening in deep space. Well, deep space is impossible for people to survive. The radiation is far more intense. Gravity, weightlessness. You have to deal with weightlessness for decades. I mean, for many years, if you're on a long mission, there's toxic chemicals in the spacecraft. You can't take a bath. You're psychologically isolated. And so my conclusion, which surprised me, frankly, once I went into the literature, was that every organ in the human body is damaged by being in deep space from weightlessness and radiation and toxic chemicals. So that was the conclusion I came to. Then I went and looked at what NASA has been saying, and they sort of glossed this all over. As I said, there are these really merry astronauts in the space station that are very happy and so forth. But that's not the truth. And so I felt like the book really had to tell the truth from a scientific point of view.
Could you give us a little breakdown of some of the science institutions you've worked for in the past?
Well, I've worked for Caltech, MIT, Cornell, Duke, and University of Wisconsin as a research communicator. And in many of those places, I was involved in the space program, reporting on it and writing about it.
You mentioned the Earth's magnetosphere, the Van Allen belts. It takes radiation from the sun and cosmic radiation and shields the Earth. And that's generated by a liquid metal iron core in the Earth. There is no such core in Mars. There is no such shielding from radiation on the surface of Mars and then getting there. So I really think we should start off by talking about the elephant in the room and what no one really ever talks about. And if they do, they say, oh, well, this problem will be solved. Let's talk about radiation, the types that astronauts can experience, and what that really means for a human being to be exposed to not only just solar radiation, but cosmic radiation if they're in deep space.
Well, you're absolutely right. NASA has not talked about, not made very public, these kinds of risks. But privately, and if you delve into the NASA's websites, you'll find what they call red risks. And there's a whole bunch of red risks that they have not solved. And the biggest one is radiation. And radiation comes in the form of what I call 22 caliber bullets and rifle bullets and armor piercing radiation. And the armor piercing radiation are cosmic rays. Now very few make it to Earth because of the magnetosphere. But in outer space, these armor piercing radiation can go through anything. And if you try to give astronauts a lot of shielding, what happens is the cosmic rays penetrate the shielding and they create a cascade of secondary particles. So shrapnel, as it were. And the shrapnel is still dangerous. And to give you an example of how dangerous it is, between the Apollo 16 and 17 missions, there was an intense solar radiation storm. So cosmic rays come from outside the solar system, but the sun also produces this high energy radiation. Between Apollo 16 and 17, there was a radiation storm that if Apollo astronauts had been in space between the Earth and the Moon, they would have died. Now, that same radiation, the solar radiation and cosmic radiation, is not stopped on the Moon, on Mars, or in interplanetary space. There's nothing to stop it. So the people, the astronauts who land on the Moon or who attempt to get to Mars are going to be exposed to this. And it's one of those red risks that has not been solved, and it will not be solved.
So if someone were to say to you, Dennis, look, they're going to come up with shielding, what would you say to that?
Well, you could shield it, but then you'd have to have an object the size of the Earth with a magnetic field the size of the Earth's to shield it. So I'm not sure you could do that in space. But I should say that although obviously they've not had any humans in interplanetary space for any length of time, they have done experimental studies on Earth with animals in particle accelerators that they exposed to simulated cosmic radiation. And so they have solid laboratory experiments, evidence that this cosmic radiation does cause damage to cells, to tissues, and to whole organs, all of the organs of the body. So it's not possible to shield yourself from cosmic radiation.
You had an interesting segment. It was called Brain Damage from Armor-Piercing Radiation. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah. First of all, you have brain damage from cosmic rays, from radiation, but then you have the brain is weightless, and the brain is just like pudding. It's not a very solid organ. And so the brain tends to float around in the skull in weightlessness. And so at the same time it's being bombarded by cosmic radiation and other radiation, it's shifting shape, and it's undergoing all sorts of physical changes due to weightlessness. Now, there has been research with animals and MRI studies with astronauts that show that this happens, and they also show that it creates psychological impacts. There's a phenomenon called space brain. Astronauts recognize that they get what's called space brain, and that's where they get foggy, they can't concentrate, and it's because their brains are undergoing all of these insults, both from radiation and from weightlessness, but also toxic chemicals. The interior of spacecraft has all sorts of toxic chemicals that come from plastics and so forth. So there's all of these insults going on to the brain that cause this kind of psychological impact.
And the eyes are also strangely susceptible to problems from weightlessness.
Yes, the minute the astronauts go onto the International Space Station, their vision starts to get cloudy because they're not sure exactly why. They think it has to do with weightlessness effect on the eye, but it gets cloudier and cloudier. And a lot of astronauts on the space station have to start wearing glasses, and it gets worse. And they don't know specifically what causes it. They do know that it's almost inevitable. So you have a situation where astronauts who go on deep space missions or to the moon, their eyes are going to get more cloudy. They may even go blind. They're not sure what's going to happen. And also they undergo these brain changes too. So imagine an astronaut who has been in space for 9 months with all these insults, and then they have to land on Mars, and their bones are weakened, their muscles are weakened, their brains are not working right, they can't see very well, and instantly they have to transition to a functional status and wearing a 100-pound spacesuit and going out and doing things to survive.
There are things you don't really hear about very often, and I think this book is very interesting to bring up these topics, and we're just on the surface of it. And I know there's a lot to talk about, but we have to be careful not to confuse our audience with too many things at once. It's sort of especially since we've grown up, many of us, being told that all of these challenges are going to fall away because of human ingenuity and this almost predestined fate. And it's in science fiction programs all the time, just these ways to address things, like gravity, like weightlessness. We'll just turn the ship. We'll just rotate it. The 2001, I think, Space Odyssey famously addressed that in the beginning. And a lot of people know that if you're in a rotating vessel, it can simulate gravity. Why can't that be used on a trip to Mars, Dennis?
Well, first of all, building a rotating NASA has never considered seriously building rotating spacecraft because they know that it would be incredibly expensive. You'd have to have all this machinery. It would have to work perfectly. If an astronaut wanted to go outside, they would actually have to stop the space station so that he or she didn't get thrown off. And then there'd be this Coriolis effect that where your feet are going slower than your head. It's like being on a merry-go-round where you're hanging your head out, and people can't cope with that. And so nobody has ever seriously considered artificial gravity. If you wanted to have artificial gravity work, you'd have to have a space station the size of a city to get rid of the Coriolis effect and deal with it. But it's just not considered practical at all.
Right. I mean, that seems like a simple solution, but engineering-wise, that's huge. Economics-wise, that's huge. And then let's say you want to have a colony on Mars. You still have reduced gravity on Mars and definitely on the Moon. What is Mars? Is that
40%.
70%? What is
40%.
40%, that's not weightless, but that's going to probably have an effect on human beings living there for an extended period of time.
Actually, yes, absolutely. They're not sure that people can even survive well at 40% gravity, because we evolved in 100% gravity. So even if you say, oh, if there is gravity on Mars, it's only 40%. And so it has huge effects, all sorts of effects. For example, because Mars has lower gravity, dust storms can be just hell, because the dust will stay in the air, the atmosphere for weeks on end. And then, of course, as I said, when an astronaut lands on Mars after being in space for 9 months, even though it's 40% gravity, they have to wear 150 pound on Mars spacesuit to cope. And so even though the Mars gravity is lower, it's still profoundly affecting.
Right. And then there's issues that you bring up in the book that you don't see often addressed, even in science fiction. Regolith, or sharp dust on the moon, hasn't been smoothed by winds or erosion. It's basically due to meteoroids or meteoric explosions and abrasions and radiation. Is very sharp. And there's a lot of experience from the lunar missions when it comes to how abrasive it is for suits during these short missions. Now, this lunar dust just degrades spacesuits. That it's very hazardous to humans. So could you talk about the dust hazards that we really don't see a lot about?
Yeah, they've really dismissed. They've downplayed the dangers of dust, but the Apollo astronauts noticed that they all got lung problems from the dust, and they all got what they call lunar hay fever, and also it began to abrade their suits. It got into electronics, and this dust is not dust like on Earth. It's imagine dust that is as sharp as razor blades. And they also have really weird problems because of the gravity on Mars. They get what they call dust bullets. If a large spacecraft lands on the moon, the explosion of dust and rocks and so forth can send rocks at high speeds across the whole lunar surface. So if you're near a spacecraft that's landing on the moon, you could have something that did damage to your suit or to the habitat. So they have dust bullets on the moon. Well, Mars is terrible in another way. The dust on Mars has been smoothed by the winds, but it's toxic. It has chemicals in it that are toxic. So the whole business of in the Martian, where he was growing potatoes on Mars, he would have been poisoned immediately by the poison in the dust.
Yeah, in the book, I think you say that it's a class of perchlorate.
Perchlorates, yes.
So there's actually a lot of perchlorate in Martian soil, and that's another toxic aspect. You don't hear about that. You don't hear about the radiation hazard, the perchlorate. Now, let's just talk about distance and time. I mean, for our Mars mission, and Mars is relatively close, right? I mean, we're not even talking about interstellar, which, I mean, that's a whole other category of not going to happen. And in my opinion, there's the economics is not there, just the distance. But let's just talk about with these concerns of radiation, a toxic environment, microgravity, or what we call weightlessness, and the distance and time it takes to go from Earth to Mars. It's not a straight shot either. I mean, you look at Mars, you say, oh, that's so far away. Orbital mechanics is such that, and the energy that you use to get off the Earth, you're going to have to take these long trajectories, and we don't need to get into it, but you got the conjunction class and the opposition class launches, all that type of stuff. But what's the average trip look like, or what's an optimal trip look like to Mars? What's the amount of time and before you get there, and then how long do you have to stay on the surface if you land, and not an orbital mission around Mars, but if you land, you're going to have to wait for another launch window. So what does an optimal trip to Mars look like, and how long would a human being or a group of human beings have to endure these hazards if they were on such a trip?
You'd be in your spacecraft, which would be the size of a motorhome, with several other people, 3 or 4 other people, for 9 months. There are no windows because there's nothing to look out at. You're weightless. You're being exposed to gravity to weightlessness for that 9 months. You have to eat packaged food. You can't take a bath. It really gets smelly in there. And then you get to Mars, and you go down to the surface, and you have to be there for a month. That's one of the types of missions. So you have to deal with being at 40% Earth gravity for a month inside a spacesuit or inside a habitat, and then you have to take off again and have another 9 months back to Earth. And so it's just at this whole time you're exposed to, except when you're on the Martian surface, you're exposed to weightlessness, you're exposed to toxic chemicals, you're exposed to radiation, and you also have to cope with alarms that require you to fix the spaceship. And the ISS has several dozen alarms a year where they have to fix the ISS or die. So you have to carry tons and tons of of spare parts, tons and tons of food. You have to figure out how to get rid of your waste and so forth. So it's just it's hell in space.
You have this radiation. You have the normal psychological effects of being cramped into these quarters with other people. But then you have, psychological degradation is expected from radiation, weightlessness, vision problems from microgravity or weightlessness. Then the alarms. Then all these things that have to be addressed, these repairs. You're going to have to do it in a degraded state.
Yes, and in fact, it's impossible, at least to my mind, to train astronauts to handle all these things. There was one study that said that astronauts that are supposed to go to Mars need to learn 2,000 skills, and even the astronauts that go to the ISS, they've said, I was supposed to do something, but I completely forgot how to do it because I was trained years ago. And thus I need to rely on the people on the ground. Well, you can't rely on the people on the ground when you're in mid-flight to Mars because the delay and so forth, and you're stuck. You can't turn around and go back because you're on this trip toward Mars that will take you there. And the only thing you could do would be to loop around the planet and come back, but that would still be another 9 months. So it's just an unsolvable problem, in my opinion. And one thing I would suggest people watch is when somebody comes back from the International Space Station, you will never see an astronaut get out of the capsule and walk away. They put them on a stretcher because when you come back from Earth, from the ISS, you are crippled. You can't see very well. Your brain is foggy. Your bones and muscles have deteriorated. And so NASA does not very often show what happens when an astronaut actually gets out of a capsule and goes onto that stretcher.
Let's say we say, okay, we can send someone to Mars, land, and even get them back. Let's say that's, and you're saying, no, space is a serial killer. There's all these problems, and the synergistic effect of all these problems just makes it a non-starter. And I tend to agree with you. I definitely wouldn't want to be on the mission, and I don't know if it would be ethical to send anyone on that mission, as you raise in your book. But let's say you can do that. This notion of having a colony on Mars, or that humans are going to adapt to other planets, looking at just this, It's a
Yeah,
crazy
absolutely.
notion.
Even Elon Musk has said that a colony on Mars would cost $1 trillion. Now, I should also add that I did a section on what it would be like to be a colonist on Mars. You would be you would constantly require supplies from Earth because you wouldn't be able to grow food on Mars because you'd need acres and acres and acres of enclosed growth chambers to grow for a minimal number of people. You'd need specialized plants, you need specialized equipment, you need to recycle everything. So you'd have to have a constant supply of food and spare parts. So a Mars colony would be constantly in danger of collapse because they would require this constant supply of equipment and food.
So no viability there. I mean, the argument of Musk's, though, on the other hand, is if we don't become a multi-planet species, and I think he's ripping off other people when he comes to saying this. I mean, it's part of old Rand reports and stuff, Werner von Braun, whatever. If we don't become a multi-planet species, we face extinction. Well, human beings aren't going to be viable, and autonomous on an alien planet. Given it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I say that let's forget about the space frontier. Let's have an environmental frontier on Earth. We don't know all of the species that exist on Earth. We haven't explored Earth yet. So let's explore Earth. If you go to Google and you type in new species discovered, you will find all sorts of stories about new species constantly being discovered on Earth. So my takeaway message for my own personal feelings is let's finish exploring Earth. Let's have an environmental frontier where we concentrate on Earth. We concentrate on preserving Earth and understanding Earth before we spend tons and tons and tons of money sending astronauts on a one-way trip, and I'm afraid it would be a one-way trip to another planet. And then they talk about terraforming Mars. Well, that's first of all, nobody's figured out how to do it, and secondly, it would take centuries to do, and it probably wouldn't work anyway.
Well, you're not going to create a magnetic field around Mars. I don't know. And how long have they been talking about this? I mean, it goes back to the 40s with Oberth, with Walt Disney was part of the push back in the day. I don't know. You remember that, don't you? Werner von.
I was a big fan back then of Werner von Braun and Disney and so forth. Yeah, there are what I call cosmic cheerleaders that really are advocating Mars, and this includes people, the billionaires. It includes profit-seeking corporations. It includes NASA itself. It includes these space advocates and so forth. And it's basically just hand waving that they want to go do this. But the hard numbers are that it would cost $210 billion to mount a Mars mission. And it's just why it's not worth it. Let's spend the $200 billion on Earth, where it'll do some good.
I really, this jumped out at me in your book. I love this. You wrote, I would argue that admitting that we are deeply dependent on our home planet would help us develop a productive humility that would make us value our planet more.
There is life in the solar system, and it's here. And let's explore Earth. Let's value Earth.
You mentioned intelligent life. It's here on Earth. I mean, it's almost like we also assume that there's just intelligent life all over the place. How do we know that intelligence is a convergent evolutionary phenomenon? I mean, maybe there is life elsewhere, but maybe intelligence is just not all it's cracked up to be. Maybe it's not adaptive in a lot of places or anywhere else. We've been searching for a long time, and there's the Fermi paradox. The nuclear physicist Fermi said, well, if there is intelligent life elsewhere, where are they? Why haven't they contacted us?
Where are they? Yeah, exactly. So, I have to assume that somewhere in this vast universe there is intelligent life, but I don't know if it's a survival trait yet. I think we may find out over the next centuries or so on our own terms. But I think I think we need to take advantage of the intelligence we have now, and do something productive with it in terms of maintaining our own environment and maintaining our Earth.
I do want to be fair to you. You are an advocate for space exploration, robotic, going out into space, but using, robotics that, sending humans. Why? Why? If you can send probes, why send humans? It just increased the cost. It's just this romantic notion. But there was talk that, as things evolved, well, you're not going to get funding unless you have the humans involved, no Buck Rogers, no bucks. Thought on that?
Yeah, no Buck Rogers, no bucks. Well, I had this great idea, though. I think we need to concentrate on artificially intelligent robots and send them everywhere in the solar system to explore, and have a high speed, high bandwidth connection to Earth to send the data back, and create a virtual cosmos, a virtual reality cosmos, so that everybody on Earth could walk on Venus. We could explore Martian caves. We could go into the sub-ice oceans of Europa. And so that's what I think. We're tool makers. Let's make the tools to explore the solar system. And NASA's already doing that. They're kind of not making it obvious that's what they're doing. But there's some really cool robots that they're developing that are actually going to be launched soon. There's one called Cadre for the cooperative. It's a mouthful. Cooperative Autonomous Distributed Robotic Exploration. Okay, big word. What happens is a lander comes down on the moon, and it's being launched this year. A lander comes down. It lowers these little wheeled robots, 3 of them. And they go scurrying across the lunar surface and mapping it using ground-penetrating radar, but they're cooperating with each other. It has nothing, they don't even consult with humans. They're talking to each other and saying, okay, you go over here and you go over here and I'll go over here. So that's the kind of thing that can be done with artificial intelligence. And we all know that artificial intelligence is exploding on Earth. Well, I think we need to apply it to the solar system.
Yeah, there may be a good job for artificial intelligence. We just did a show on how they're using it for genetic engineering, and very, very dubious of that project. And also the AI, it really robs or steals or uses a lot of energy, and it is not free. But I do hear what you're saying. Let's do space science if we're going to do that. But why do we need this infantile notion of Buck Rogers?
Yeah. I'm advocating what I call neuronauts. And neuronauts are artificially intelligent spacecraft and landers that work with scientists on Earth, and they collaborate. And the scientists on Earth say, okay, listen, we need to find out this. And the artificially intelligent lander or rover or spacecraft says, okay, I'm going to do it this way, all right? And the scientist says, well, okay, go ahead. And it goes and does that. And there's another really cool robot that's going to be launched in 2028 called Dragonfly. And it's going to land on Titan. And it looks like this bobsled with propellers. And Dragonfly is going to decide for itself where it wants to go. And Dragonfly is going to say, okay, the scientists are going to say, look, we need to find out this, 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 and this. And Dragonfly will say, okay, then I'm going to go up in the atmosphere of Titan. I'm going to go around and I'm going to look for a spot that's going to help answer that. And I'm going to land and I'm going to take samples and drill and so forth. And then I'm going to go over here and then I'm going to go over here. And it's going to do it on its own. So the bottom line is NASA is already doing this. And let's take this massive budget that we're spending on landing a few humans on a radiation blasted surface and instead spend it on these artificially intelligent robots that are going to get far more information, data, and send it back to Earth and then let us experience it for ourselves.
And let's keep all artificial intelligence robots on other planets and moons of other planets. We could agree on that. We could agree on that. Let's put it that way, Dennis.
I absolutely agree.
Because there's some aspects to AI that are a little scary too,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
March 31st is the release date. So how would anyone find out more about this book or how to get it?
It's on Amazon, and there's a website, earthboundthebook.com, that has a table of contents, the introduction, the references. And I should say that one of the reasons that I made it a pretty rigorous technical book is that I didn't want people to say, well, you're just hand waving, you don't have the data. So it has 644 references to scientific papers, so that any scientist who says that I don't know what I'm talking about can go back to the scientific papers and reports that I cite.
Let's hope this starts to get some coverage. I think it's very important now, and that's one of the reasons why I ask you on the show, is because right now, the techno bros are having a lot of outsized, I would say outsized influence on our culture right now. And they're really pushing this, humanity is going to seed the stars. And I don't know, do you think they really believe that?
Well, they do, but I've seen some cracks in the facade. I see that Musk has just opened requests for proposals to study the biological and physiological effects of space, and he's just starting. I think he won't. They're not saying this publicly, not saying it out loud, but I think even Musk is beginning to realize these huge obstacles that he faces. So even though he's a rocket man, I think he's having a little, or at least SpaceX is having a little some second thoughts, or some more sophisticated thoughts about what the effects of space are.
Now that we're talking about it, I think maybe Musk could try. I think Musk ought to try to get that. If it's Musk who's going, I'm all behind it. You're not going. I know you're going to remain obscure.
Yes, I am.
Dennis Meredith, thank you for joining us on Breaking Green.
My pleasure, Steve. And again, thanks so much for having me on.
You have been listening to Breaking Green, a Global Justice Ecology Project podcast. To learn more about Global Justice Ecology Project, visit globaljusticeecology.org. Breaking Green is made possible by tax-deductible donations by people like you. Please help us lift up the voices of those working to protect forests, defend human rights, and expose false solutions. Simply text GIVE, G-I-V-E, to 1-716-257-4187. That's 1-716-257-4187.